Hi everyone, and welcome to the second episode of our Papertalk, Catching Up with Research. I'm Timo, a student assistant in the group for Political Urbanism and Sustainable Spatial Development. In this series, I'm catching up with the research my colleagues are doing every day and sharing key ideas from it with you. This week, we are going to discuss Adrien Guisan, Tianzhu Liu and Jean-David Gerber's newly published paper, Housing Commons, a Scoping Review, published in the International Journal of the Commons. Housing is usually presented as a private good or, though to a lesser extent, as a public good. However, according to Guisan, Liu and Gerber, a third type of good has received increasing attention from housing researchers in the recent decades: commons. Not only has the notion of commons been applied to a wide range of empirical contexts, but these applications have been preceded by plural, sometimes even conflicting interpretations of the concepts, resulting in a highly diverse field of research. The authors acknowledge the necessity and usefulness of such conceptual pluralism in order to reflect a complex and evolving social reality. At the same time, however, they also highlight the confusion and misunderstandings to which such conceptualization can lead. In order to navigate conceptual ambiguities in academic debate, it is helpful to sharpen terms by making explicit the meanings, purposes, and implications that are subsumed under the concept. Guisan, Liu and Gerber's paper is the first to provide a comprehensive overview of the existing literature that allows for clarification. The aim is to clarify how the diverse concept of commons has been used in housing research and whether there are methodological, regional or temporal variations. So what literature are the authors looking at? How does a scoping review work? And how were the many different approaches to housing commons finally bundled into overarching conceptual strands in the literature? These are the questions discussed in the methods chapter. So let's have a look. Literature reviews begin with the formulation of a search strategy. The search strategy is here designed to identify studies that discuss housing and commons. They limit the search to journal articles and edited book chapters in order to maintain reproducibility. In addition, only English language documents were included. The starting date of the search period was set at 1900, the year in which Elinor Ostrom published Governing the Commons, which sparked a renewed academic interest in the subject. Once these inclusion and exclusion criteria for the search have been defined, specific keywords describing the two central concepts are compiled and entered into the searches of the databases considered. For example, the keywords housing, dwelling, condominium, squatting, and flat are defined to represent the concept of housing. Finally, the search terms are linked using Boolean operators so that the references in the search outputs has to contain at least one of the keywords of both concepts in the title or abstract. 3 databases are consulted: Scopus, Web of Science, and the International Bibliography of the Social Sciences, which are considered particularly suitable for reviews because of the consistent design of the search engines. This search returned 383 records, which Guisan and Liu then independently screened for thematic congruence, resulting in a final corpus of 110 documents. They then conduct a systematic thematic analysis of this corpus. Guisan and Liu use an OpenXCL selective method of coding in 3 steps. In the first round, they start with emerging codes, so they mark open inductively from the text. They then organize these codes into superordinate categories. Finally, in following rounds, they select 2 main criteria, so-called dimensions, along which their analysis should be oriented afterwards. They analyze the conceptual dimension along 3 categories: the entry point, which describes the basic assumptions and claims of the researchers regarding the nature of the commons. The conceptual focus, which refers to the aspect of the commons on which the study focuses. And finally, the scholar focus, which takes into account the analytical level at which the researchers analyze the commons. For the second dimension, the operational approach, they assess the resources at stake, the type of community involved, and the housing type analyzed in the publication. Having categorized these papers according to the 6 categories, they now carry out a clustering to group publications with similar approaches along both categories. They do this using the K-modes algorithm. The idea behind this approach is to organize data points accordingly to their attributes. In this case, the values in the different categories, so that individual clusters are qualified by a specific set of attributes shared most frequently by its data points. To simplify the process, the clustering is performed in 2 consecutive steps. In the first step, they identify intermediate clusters for each of the 2 dimensions based on the respective categories. In a second step, they merge the dimension clusters by identifying articles that shared both similar conceptual and operational approaches. So let's turn to the results of the analysis. Which clusters emerged for the 2 dimensions, first individually and then in combination? For the conceptual dimension, the authors find 5 entry points that bring together different assumptions, definitions, and beliefs about commons. The first consists of articles that frame commons as common pool resources and focus on collective action problems. The second group frames commons in terms of use value, as common goods whose collective fruition must be safeguarded. The first emphasizes commoning and its links to the concept of social reproductions. Finally, the fourth and fifth groups use commons and commoning interchangeably to discuss participatory modes of urban governance and alternatives to capitalism. In terms of conceptual focus, most studies discuss community characteristics and practices or institutions and their impacts, while fewer emphasize resource characteristics and uses or take a holistic approach. In terms of the third category of the conceptual dimension, the scholar focus more than half of the studies in the sample are identified as being conducted at the micro level, focusing on organizational or individual issues. In contrast, macro-level studies, which make up the second largest group, examine the links between political structures and organizations. Meso-level studies focus on networks between organizations or individuals. Crucially, the 3 categories of the conceptual dimension turn out to be strongly interrelated, resulting in well-matched intermediate clusters. For the second operational dimension, they focus on the resource at stake, the type of community involved, and the type of housing. In addition to housing stock, the most common type of resource discussed, they identify 2 other resource groups with shared infrastructure and urban space. In terms of the communities covered in the corpus, most communities are classified as closed, Vira as semi-open, and the fewest as open. Housing types vary, with collectivized housing, including housing cooperatives, being the most common, followed by squats, private, public, and mixed housing. As with the conceptual dimension, the categories of the operational dimensions are strongly interrelated, as evidenced by the good correspondence of the clusters. The final clusters eventually result from the merge of observations across the categories of both dimensions. The persistence of the clusters is remarkable. It appears that, to a far extent, the observations that form a cluster for the conceptual dimension are also reflected in a common cluster for the operational dimension. In this sense, the final 5 clusters result directly from the combination of the clusters in the 2 dimensions. We will now explore them in more detail. The first final cluster, Guisan, Liu and Gerber define, they call commons in housing. This cluster centers around analyzing collective action problems, particularly the management of shared infrastructure in multi-owned housing. Multi-owned housing refers to residential development with separate housing units within one shared building complex. In these publications, topics such as the factors impacting the maintenance of physical and social infrastructures, or organizational issues, for example, the decision-making in the context of collective renovation, are being discussed. With a focus on the uses and long-term sustainability of a resource system, shared infrastructure is here framed as a common pool resource. The communities analyzed are typically limited to co-owners. The second cluster is named Housing as Commons and centers on the idea that housing can be treated as a commons through collective ownership and governance. Underlying the studies is the normative claim that housing should be readily accessible and affordable, not a vehicle for capital accumulation. The key assumption in this cluster is that collective ownership and governance prioritize use value, protecting housing from market pressure and ensuring long-term affordability and access. The conceptual focus is on rules. Many studies in this cluster focus on forms of collective tenure that limit speculation, such as housing cooperatives. Some would view these forms as potential pathways to post-growth futures, while others, however, note the tension between ideas of widespread access and the actual bounded nature of the communities studied. Commoning housing is the third cluster. It is rooted in the commoning literature, especially feminist and citizenship approaches focusing on collective practices and the importance for needs satisfaction. The commons here are understood as dynamic webs of social relations, constantly being reproduced and redefined through practices of commoning. Hence, both resources and static institutions are given secondary importance. Instead, commons emerge from continuous collective practices, especially labor. Most studies in this cluster account for broader political and economic structures and dynamics, such as gentrification, but tend to focus on the micro level, the collective practices ensuring the reproduction of a community and resource system. The types of communities considered are typically more fluid than in the first 2 clusters, likely due to the nature of the housing types analyzed, squats and public housing. The fourth cluster is given the name Commons, Commoning for Housing. The publications in the fourth cluster share a framing of commons as a means of democratizing city-making and urban governance through co-productions. The notion of commons and commoning are mobilized to describe processes of cooperation and co-production of collective goods and services between various actors. Most studies in this cluster adopt a meso-level perspective, focusing on rules and processes related to decision-making and public participation. Operationally, the studies in this cluster focus on collectivized or public housing in various resource and community types. Commons, commoning as a political practice, is the name the authors give to the fifth and final cluster. This cluster can be distinguished by its radical perspective on the commons. While clusters 2 and 4 view commons as potential vehicles of political mobilization for post-capitalist or post-growth futures, they often consider it accidental and conditional. In contrast, studies in the 5th cluster frame commoning and the commons as inherently political and generally at odds with capitalist relations. Although all researchers in this cluster agree on the political nature of the commons, the extent of the radicalism is debated. Focusing on political mobilization and resistance, most authors in this cluster analyze the commons from a macro-level perspective in the relation to exogenous forces. They focus on collective practices with a marked preference for studying housing squads. The resource considered often extends beyond housing to urban space. After formulating these 5 clusters, which map the variation in conceptual and operational approach, the authors analyzed their corpus in terms of variation, additional variables. Those are, under others, the methods applied, geography, and temporality. They find that only 10% of the studies analyzed are based on quantitative approach, and that these can be located exclusively in the 1st cluster, commons in housing. Most publications are based on qualitative methods and use different types of data collections, with case studies being the most common. Interviews and observations are the most common data sources, followed by documents and secondary sources. In terms of geographical variations, Europe is considered to be overrepresented in the research at the expense of other regions, particularly Africa, Middle and South America. However, this overrepresentation is in parts balanced by some regions being more strongly associated with a particular approach. For example, the authors note that the analysis of collective action problems in multi-owned housing is particularly prevalent in Eastern Asia. Eventually, research on housing common is predominantly young and emerged only as a field around 2015. In the concluding discussion, Guisan, Liu and Gerber summarized their findings. Their analysis shows high degree of pluralism in the field of housing commons, both in terms of how commons are understood and the objects or situations to which it is applied. They map this pluralism in 5 clusters. For the authors, the main differences between the identified commons concepts, despite clear demarcation lines within all of the categories examined, lie mainly in the entry points for mobilizing the notion of the commons. The meaning assigned to the notion of commons varied depending on the purpose and object of research, the authors note. They identify 3 primary meanings ascribed to commons in their corpus. First, commons as a common pool resource. Second, as a set of rules defined by a community to govern the use of a resource and protect it. And third, commons as a type of good that should be universally accessible. The framework they formulate helps to make this conceptual pluralism explicit, rather than negating it. They conclude with a recommendation to their colleagues in the field. Housing researchers should be explicit about their motivations and assumptions when using the commons concept.